Afternoon and welcome to our program, The Global Movement for Black Lives. I'm Lauren Swartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I'm really excited for today's discussion, which hits our sweet spot of bringing a world affairs perspective to a topic that deeply affects our own society and communities. For 72 years, this council has been doing just that, delivering fresh, nonpartisan, and civil discourse on the critical issues affecting the world and our home. With the myriad challenges over the last 2 years and everything we're all facing today with the pandemic and climate and economics and political changes, it's more important than ever to keep talking and leaning into new ideas and different ways of thinking, honing our skills at respectful discussion, even when we don't agree, or perhaps especially when we don't agree or understand. Last year, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis led to massive Black Lives Matter protests across the United States and inspired a global reckoning over racial justice. People took to the streets here at home and also in Germany, Brazil, Canada, South Africa, France, Mexico, the UK, and far beyond. They protested police tactics, disproportionate incarceration rates of Black and Indigenous people, and other forms of systemic racism. What were those movements like in other countries? How did governments respond? Was any lasting change ignited? I know we're all eager to hear from our panelists around the world very shortly. Quickly, before we dive further into the topic, I'd like to offer a special mention to the nearly 3,000 students and teachers who participate in the Council's World Affairs education programs throughout the year. Many of them are young people joining us today. While they are students, they're also the leaders of the future, and they are leading change-making actions today. We welcome our students and teachers and wish them much luck in this very unusual school year. After opening remarks from our guest panelists and a moderated conversation, we'll move into audience question and answer. Throughout the program, we want to hear your questions from our audience. So please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform to send in questions at any point, and our moderator will facilitate. And as always, the first question will come from a student. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator and guest panelists. Today, we are joined by Antonio Jose Basilar da Silva, Assistant Professor of Brazil Studies at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Arizona. Before joining the Center for Latin American Studies, he conducted ethnographic research on the impact of electoral campaigning with a race appeal on Afro-Brazilian voters in Salvador, Brazil. He's currently focused on the intersections of race, class, and the citizenship and democratic participation in Brazil and throughout Latin America. Next, we have Dr. June Francis, Associate Professor of Marketing at the Simon Fraser University, Beatty School of Business. She's the director of the Institute for Diaspora Research and Engagement at SFU. June was named the Special Advisor to the President on Anti-Racism at SFU this summer, and she's well known for her deep expertise in race, racism, diversity, and interculturality, leadership, and participatory engagement approaches with vulnerable and excluded groups. Internationally, June has worked in China, the Caribbean, South America, and Europe to strengthen governance and create inclusion for racialized minority groups. Our third panelist is Angelo Camufingo, a German-Angolan freelance anti-racism and education speaker, consultant, and social justice activist, and a diversity and inclusion trainer. He's completing his Master's of Education in English and French at the University of Potsdam in Germany, where he represents interests in the Education Policy and Teaching Office of the General Student Committee. Formerly, he worked in their anti-racism office as well. His research focuses on marginalized realities, specifically racialized ones, and educational environments, anti-colonial teaching, critical anti-discriminatory education, and autoethnographies on power structures, knowledge, emotions, and colonial continuities. Finally, we welcome Christy Aletto, our moderator for this afternoon and a member of the 6 ABC News team here in Philadelphia. Christy is an AP and Emmy Award-winning journalist and an experienced multimedia storyteller. She joined the 6 ABC News station in 2015 after having previously worked in Baltimore, Maryland, Huntsville, Alabama, Alabama, and Albuquerque for various stations. She attended the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University and is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. Welcome to you all, and thanks to our audience, members, and new friends for joining us today. I'll pass the virtual microphone to Christy and set the stage to begin our discussion. Christy, over to you.
Myself. Okay, can you guys hear me? Great. So thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. Yes, I am Christy Aletto, and I work at 6ABC primarily in the evening, but sometimes I pop in and out earlier and all of the other newscasts. And like you said, I am AP and Emmy award-winning journalist. A lot of the stories that I've covered recently here in Philadelphia have been about a lot of the crime that we're experiencing. And of course, last year, the racial reckoning and the fallout from the murder of George Floyd, as we saw a lot of the protests happening in Minneapolis and of course across the country, including here in Philadelphia. And so I have been covering that at least in the last year. And that was not my first time covering those types of stories. In Baltimore, I covered the arrest and death of Freddie Gray, who died in police custody in 2015. And I also covered the protests and the riots that sparked from that. So very familiar with these types of stories. Sadly, this continues to happen. But as you know, this is something that a lot of people are talking about. It's something that impacts a lot of people in their day-to-day lives. And with what happened last year, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement kind of spur, not just in the United States, but also internationally. And of course that, that was kind of born out of what happened in Ferguson in 2014. So I would really like to hear from our panelists just about, where your stance is on that. That would be Antonio, Angela, and June, and just how you guys have interacted and what you've seen across the globe of how this doesn't just affect the people that live in the United States, but it impacts, Black and Brown and Indigenous people all around the world. June, I'll start with you since your mic seems to be open.
Thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to be here. And Christine, I'm so delighted to meet you, and also my colleagues around the world. I love Brazil. I'll shout out to because I have spent time there and have a lot of colleagues in Brazil. I just wanted to say that one of the things that was surprising, I think, let me start where I wanted to start, which is to say, I am on the unceded territory, and I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory in Canada on the west coast of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. And I situate myself there because I often say that I am a stolen person that was placed on stolen lands. And I am Jamaican by birth, and I was born in the country that is now called Jamaica, was called by the Taino people Examaica. And as you know, I come from a slave society. We were enslaved, etc. And I just wanted to say who I am. I come from a long line of people who were enslaved. My DNA demonstrate the incredible horrors of slavery right in my own DNA. So I moved to Canada, and I'm coming to you from Canada, and I must say to you that to answer your question, I had to say how surprised Canadians were. By that I mean the dominant groups. Black Canadians were not surprised that it ignited a reaction in Canada. You see, Canada has long sold itself around the world as the multicultural paradise and has long denied its own history of genocide, slavery in particular, and segregation. But Canada was obviously part of the British North America. The realities of what happened in the United States were part of our reality here. Canada often has sold itself at the end of the Underground Railway, but really has been a lot of marketing around itself, around what it sees itself as. And when we look at every, and I won't keep going on, but every statistics in Canada, be it education, employment, policing, all of the issues that we so deal with globally, Black Canadians are experiencing the very lowest rung of Canadian society, along with Indigenous people. So for the Black perspective, we were not surprised that it spontaneously created a possibility for us to remind Canadians of who we were and to create our visibility in what they have long done, which is to erase the history of Black people in this country.
Do you say that the interactions of Black Canadians is very similar as to the interactions with police with Black Americans in policing?
We have all the statistics. It's the same. We're over policed. We're more likely, significantly more likely. In my city, Vancouver, we're 5 times more likely to be stopped. In Toronto, 20 times more likely to die at the hands of police violence. Policing continues to be one of the areas where, and I would say it's Black and Indigenous people, always incarcerated at a higher rate, subject to worse sentencing, over stopped and search. All of those things also characterize our experience in Canada.
Antonio, would you say that's a similar story in South America?
Wow, I think I'm going to add an interesting twist here. First of all, I want to thank everybody, especially the audience, for being here, and I'm very happy with this, having engaged in this conversation with my colleagues, and it's an important moment to be having these conversations, as you said, you know what I mean, and we just wish that more people were willing to engage, right? So I want to thank the audience who are willing to participate in this. And I had planned to start with a different topic, but because you just said so interesting things right there about Canada, right? So, and June probably knows that I come from a city, and that's where I do research, Salvador, Bahia, has the largest Black population outside Africa, except for Nigeria, right? So Salvador is considered in Brazil a Black city. And we have the same problems with the police as it happens in the US and in Canada. So in one of my job talks years back, right? I remember somebody in the audience asked me, wouldn't it be a solution for Salvador, because I was exposing that kind of violence, right? Inequality, and talking at the time about police violence. And the person said, wouldn't it be good just to replace Black police, white police by Black police? And I said, wow, the problem is the majority of the police is also Black. So, and then, and this go back to what I wanted to talk about, right? Which is anti-Blackness, right? So, the way to think about police violence in Salvador, it's not really between whites and non-whites, right? It's Black and non-Blacks, and non-Blacks include also Afro-Brazilians, right? So for us to understand that one thing is racism, the other thing is anti-Blackness, right? So Salvador, this comparison between Salvador, a majority Black city where the majority Black police, right? Why is it the violence against Black people, Black Brazilians, is comparable to violence against Black Brazilians in Canada, in the US, and other places, right? So then you say, that's the only way that I've been, and my colleagues who are working with issues of anti-Blackness are just distinguishing between racism and anti-Blackness. The only way to understand this and to make any improvement towards something, to find solutions is to understand anti-Blackness and to understand this relationship between Black and non-Black people. And then becomes the whole thing about understanding race relations in Latin America, especially in countries where there's a huge Black population, right? But we can talk more about it as a conversation goes. But this is, I just wanted this, which is sort of a challenge nowadays for us to understand this, right? But it's very, very important to start by, yeah, having a grasp what it is anti-Black sentiment and anti-Blackness politics, et cetera, right?
So what we saw last year unfolding in Minneapolis and then across the country here and then across the world, did that resonate with Black Brazilians last year?
Yes, but then it did. But at a moment in Brazil, and that's what I'm saying, Brazil has been making for the 30 last years huge improvements. Brazil has a system of affirmative action now with racial quotas in all prestigious public universities. Brazil has made huge gains in terms of laws, in terms of curriculum changes and everything the past 30 years. But in the past, since 2018, Brazil has kind of gone downhill. You probably all know we have a president now that it is against the Black movement. It is trying his administration is trying what he can to undo all the gains, right? So it happened exactly at that moment where Brazil, there's this extremely polarized between right and left political spectrum, et cetera, and also between minority rights and those who are fighting against the same rights, right? So it was at a time that it only exacerbated this polarity because some people are completely on board of that, while other people are completely for example, there are groups of from Bolsonaro's party only pointing out what was wrong with George Floyd at the time. You know what I mean? So Brazil was in the middle of this. It was a very complicated situation too.
So the movement, this kind of goes to the second question I was going to ask, which I think I can also segue to Angelo. But what you're saying is that the movement adversely impacted policy decisions, at least from a government standpoint in Brazil. Would you say that that's accurate? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so then, Angelo, I know that you are in Germany. Is that correct? No.
That's what I'm here for. I'm not there currently, but yes.
No, okay. Yes, and I know just from like reading the headlines over the weekend, I know Angela Merkel is no longer going to be the chancellor there, and there's a whole situation with that government. Could you talk about, did that resonate with? I mean, because we saw what was going on in Europe and how everyone was reacting to what happened last year. So, one, did it resonate with Europeans, specifically Black Europeans? And then two, what are you seeing as far as policy, or has it impacted policy or structural change?
That's a very big question. So like, just to give some context. So yes, I was born in Germany. I'm half Angolan, half German. I'm actually currently in Germany in Angola with my family, which is also very interesting because speaking about Blackness being very contextual, I'm perceived very differently here than I am in Germany, for example. And we had a lot of conversations here actually about Blackness in Germany. And it just made me remember how many people really don't know what is actually happening in Germany and how good of a job that country does to kind of like not be in the forefront when it is about racial injustices and all of these things. And I have so many people here being like, oh, but you should be grateful, which is obviously true when it comes to certain privileges. But when it comes to racism, I think it's always very interesting to have a look at Germany because, like I said, not a lot of people know about what happens here. And I think that's something that became even clearer when, like last year, when we talk about George Floyd, it is definitely a moment that resonated with Black Germans. Absolutely, it did, and sparked a lot of demonstrations as well. But also what it did spark is kind of a narrative that was like, okay, now something is moving in Germany only because of what happened with George Floyd, which is simply not true. We have a very strong Black movement since the 80s. We have had Black Lives Matter protests since 2016 yearly. And it's just something that hasn't really been visible. And if you compare the Black Lives Matter protests from last year, which were visited by, let it be, up to 25,000 people, there is also a very terrible realization of how the numbers went down again this year. So when we look at the Black Lives Matter protests in 2019, we had about 1,800 people marching. In 2020, we had about 25,000 people marching. And then in 2021, we had about 1,500 people marching. And sad as it is, you can see that these 1,500 people are the same people that have been going on the streets for a long time before that, for reasons that are just as relevant as the things that have happened to George Floyd. So there is police brutality, racist police brutality. There is very much so systemic racism in the country. The issue is we don't have data, which is something that is a big situation if you compare it to the United States or Canada, where it's not, you don't have an overview of how many Black people we have in the country, or how, like, for example, specific police incidents are being reported or are being archived, because you just don't have the numbers.
Why is there no data?
There is no data mostly because of the fact that Germany has a very difficult relationship with listing people. If you think about the types of National Socialisms and who's being listed, that is probably one of the biggest reasons of why there is no data on specific people. You have something that is called migrational background in the country, which is often used to be like, oh, but we see very great developments in people with migrational backgrounds to advance in education whatsoever, even though it's not being recognized that that can also be Swedish white people, for example. And that a lot of people who face racism don't have a migrational background as it is written in what that is supposed to be in Germany, right? So there's like a lot of invisibility when it comes to who faces what and where are these people. And if you look at police brutality specifically, and I'm going to finish after this, after last year's incidents, I think, because you asked me about policy changes, there was a strong desire for an actual study in the police that was about racial profiling that was about to take place, that was eventually canceled by the Minister of the Interior, Building and Community, because Germany decided there's no reason for that. There's no, and the state secretary said there's no evidence for any form of structural racism in the country, which is why we don't need the study. But even if we would need it, it's too one-dimensional. We cannot just assume that police officers are racist. And that's kind of where we are right now. So we're pretty much where we were before George Floyd, which is pretty terrible. So, yeah.
Do you also feel like, I mean, because, and then going back to what I've been reading over the weekend about Angela Merkel, who I guess most people will say she's credited with the golden age of Germany being very progressive, but at the same time, I mean, I also saw, you know, who narrowly won to be the next leader of this new government that has to be formed while she's staying on until it's actually formed. Do you feel like, in the same instance as Antonio was talking about, that it's kind of undoing a lot of stuff? Do you feel like it's a step backwards with her successor? And do you think that everything has played, like the BLM movement from last year has played a role in that?
The thing with Germany personally is I don't see a change. I don't see a change. It might be a different party, it might be a different chancellor, but if you've known how long Angela Merkel, for example, has been chancellor, and if you see
like a decade.
Yes, and if you see how long they have, how many people have still voted for the party, I do not see a lot of change, depending on kind of what the coalition is going to be like, and that's still something that has to be decided. But I think George Floyd, the situation with George Floyd might have sparked something when it comes to people who were already kind of in, if you want to say so, in the corner of like anti-racism and stuff like that. But I do not think that it sparked a general discussion in Germany about who we should vote for. Because if you look at the AfD, the right-wing party, they have only lost 2% of voters, which is not a lot for a right-wing party that is so new. For example, CDU, CSU, so Angela Merkel's party, is still very big, as many voters as they have lost. And then you have a huge gain in environmental justice, but that is not due to George Floyd. So gotcha. I doubt that has a big influence on that. Yeah.
I want to kind of kick the same question over to you, June, because Justin Trudeau is pretty progressive from the outside world looking in, but you might have a different opinion on that. And do you feel like, have you seen any type of undoing or significant structural change or impact in policy making since last year? Oh, you're still on mute.
No matter how long you do this, you still make the same mistake. I do want to also thank you for that question. I think Angela Merkel has actually been in power for almost 16 years. I think it's that long. Angela, I will go back to this issue of data. I just wanted, if you don't mind, if I can comment on two misconceptions. I never want to leave you with the impression that Canada collects race-based disaggregated data. Canada has been blind to Black people's anti-Black racism primarily because it has resisted collecting data. And when COVID started and we started to pressure the government, it has been a long journey. The UN has been here arguing with Canada, and the strategy that's used in Canada is to lump everybody similarly into this multiculturalism category so that it becomes opaque. That something that you said earlier, Antonio, the anti-Black racism, right? So what let me be clear that the numbers I'm giving you were because of specific access to information requests that were resisted, and etc. So we don't have a great record of collecting race-based data. I also want to say that the anti-Black racism, the reason why we see it ignite across the world is the logic of anti-Black racism pervades globally, right? It doesn't matter where you're from. The logic of European expansionism, imperialism created the myth of this racial hierarchy, and anti-Black racism was created to create whiteness. You can't understand whiteness unless you understand that Blackness was put at the other end to create white superiority. So why I'm bringing this all up is I think that anti-Black racism, and I'm glad you brought this up, underlies the racial democracy in Latin America. When you go there, everybody will tell you there is no racism. And like Germany, Canada started out saying, there is no racism here. It's Trudeau, to his credit. Now, remember, Trudeau was found wearing brown face.
Blackface. I saw it. That was like a couple years ago. I know.
Okay, so let's just be clear that this prime minister in his lifetime, and he's not that old, did not understand. So anti-Black racism, no matter the progressive left in Canada, have a lot of things going for them, but anti-Black racism is embedded in Canadian society and structures, included in the Trudeau government, okay? Now, let me just say this. The Trudeau government has been the most responsive, okay? Along with our left-leaning governments and the Green Party, to words. But, you know, and they have made some changes, okay? So let me just point one. We are now about to get in British Columbia, the province I am, the first legislation around data, okay? Right? Just making that point, we're finally going to get race-based data through the activism of so many people. There have been some changes. Last year saw the Trudeau government announce policies around Black entrepreneurship. There's been policies around embedding Black history in the curriculum. There have been some movement in other areas. Transformative, no, not yet. I see some in the ways, you know, I'm kind of been around it long enough to know that what institutions do is they do just enough to get the burden off of them. So I'm not surprised that, you know, 1 year in Germany, 25,000 people come out, the following year, they're fatigued already. So typically what we see happening here is that there's small changes. Sometimes they sound grand, but actually they don't end up in transformational changes. So they don't become deeply embedded. So at this point, I would say our policy responses have been not bad at the federal government and the provincial government, not transformational. And definitely it remains to be seen if we will see this sustain itself once the eyes are off the government.
So then, and I'm going to ask this question for everybody, but what is it going to take to make this less of a moment and more of a continual movement in all of your respective countries? Jean, I'll just start with you since you're already talking.
I think Antonio had his hand up, so I'll defer.
Oh, he did? Oh my God, Antonio, yes. I'm so sorry. Go for it.
Okay, I just want to add, because the lack of data, Canada, Germany, and also the slow response that June is talking about, right? And what I was talking about, the police department in Brazil being anti-Black, even though the majority is Black, right? So it's the talk about institution, right? That's why, so that we can switch our focus to talk about anti-Blackness and racism, et cetera, at the institutional level. So how these things are part of the fabric of these institutions, right? Whether education, or statistics, or police or public safety, all these. So when we have, that's what I think, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement is doing a great job worldwide in terms of focusing on the institutions, right? These things need to change for more data to be collected, for more response from in terms of policy, right? And the interesting thing is that what's happening in Brazil now in terms of going downward is it's an attack on all the changes that had been happening at the institutional level. For example, right, the creation during the Lula administration, or the Workers' Party administration, of a Ministry of Racial Equality, right? All these huge changes at the state level, at institutional level, are now under threat, right? And and only talk and only things done to the institutions can, to me, start changing things, affect change, right?
Okay. Angelo or June?
I'll just, I'll let, okay, since I started, let me, Angela, it was about, actually, I'm going to let Angela speak because I think he was.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. We're so kind to each other. Institutional change. You asked what it would take. And to pick up on this point about institutional change, every institution in this country was founded on two ideas: anti-Indigenous genocide, okay, that displaced Indigenous people and placed them on reservations and tried to erase them from this country. And the second one was on anti-Black racism, okay? So those two are foundational. This was to be a white settler society. Immigration was, Canada enacted immigration law. Why are there not a lot of Black people in Canada? For heaven's sake, we were this Northern Star. Because immigration specifically excluded Black Americans from coming here. And the ones that came originally on the West Coast, for example, met with such hostility that many of them would rather go back and face the known racist institutions. So let me be clear, this country was always intended to be a white dominion, and it's only recently that its immigration has opened up, let alone its schooling. There were segregated schools from all across the eastern part of this country. So when we look at schooling and universities that I'm part of, we teach Eurocentric ideas. We valorize Eurocentric norms. The school system reinforces through its institutional arrangements if it's health, it's hospitals. We know that if a Black person goes in, we don't even have the research to support their health, let alone the ways in which the institution acts to exclude Black and Indigenous people. So if you look in housing segregation existed in this country. Black people were excluded from housing. Black people continue to be excluded institutionally from banking, from getting access to capital, etc. So all the institutions, the political apparatus in this country, policing in particular, let's take policing. Policing was meant to protect white lives. And this was to protect white people against Black and Indigenous people. So it was, the very institutions were formed to support white supremacy, right? So this is why we have to audit. We have to look deeply at the institutional level. and find, unmask the racism in its structures, its policies, its practices, and it's all of those. We have to then reimagine these. It's not an incremental thing. It's the foundation needs to be broken. And we need to elevate that reimagining and bring into the center the voices and the perspectives of the people that have been marginalized. So it is quite fundamental what needs to happen. I do believe that some of that has started in Canada. There has been a reckoning that this has to happen. But I think the answer to your question is that if you look at universities, they have to be broken at their core to say, why is it you teach what you teach? It reinforces, again, white supremacy. And it's also, we have McGill University was a slave owner. Queen's University prohibited Black students. I'm just saying, these institutions at their core need to be rattled. And I'll turn it over now to Angelo.
It's kind of similar to the critical race theory debate that's happening here in the United States. Angelo, again, just reiterate the question, what is it going to take for this to be more of a movement or a continual movement and not a moment?
Yeah, thank you, Jude, for all the things that you and impulses that you already gave and said. That was really, really nice. I think when I think about Germany, and I'm trying not to only repeat stuff that has already been said, but I think a lot about history, and I think about Germany's biggest problem of like not knowing their own history, acting like we were into colonial power, acting like we didn't participate in the enslavement of people, for example, acting like we didn't have zoos where we exhibited Black people, acting like we didn't do all of these things that are part of anti-Black racism, is probably one of the biggest things to me, because usually when I think about my work or when I think about the institutions that I work with, people just don't know. And as simple as it sounds to point at education, I do think that that plays a big role, because that's why people tend to be so easily going to the States. So when we look at the George Floyd movement last year, a lot of Germans were like, oh, that's a problem from the States, simply because they knew the history and figured, oh, that kind of correlates. So there has always been this thing of like slavery and colonialism and whatnot, but they don't know about Germany and concentration camps in Namibia and so on and so forth. So I think that's like a big moment, which goes hand in hand with decolonizing movements, which are quite strong in Germany, where it's like there's a lot of groups and organizations who make it their task to go into institutions and like offer decolonial tours, or basically write letters, make sure that we change street names, that we think about monuments, that we criticize politicians, that we criticize institutions, that we go to universities and criticize universities. You have a lot of educators. If I think about my university, there's a bunch of like educators that are very interested in changing educational sciences and the teacher trainings that are happening at universities to kind of be more inclusive and think about ways in which we can educate future leaders and future leaders to have a better understanding of what is happening in the country. I think that plays a big role, and also for us to invest more into our own communities. When I think about Black communities in Germany, we're very segregated in a way where it's like we don't know where we are oftentimes, or how many we are, or where we're from. It's also different because there's many histories of why.
Angela? I think you froze. Angelo?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. Yeah, I think you froze for a sec.
Did you hear my final sentence?
No, sorry. I didn't. I
Okay.
don't know if everybody else did, but
Can you tell me where it stopped?
you were talking about how, let's say African Americans, how Black Germans live very segregated.
Oh yeah, I think I talked about like investing in our own communities and having a greater understanding of where we are, who we are, what our histories are, and kind of educating ourselves and creating an understanding of our intersectional realities in this country and bringing us together. I think that is also a big task that we have here, and that is something that is being dealt with by very good Black organizations in Germany, and also a lot of student unions. but that is, I think, a big effort because it's still very Berlin, very much Berlin, which is not comparable to a lot of the things that are going on in Germany, I think.
I also think that like we're all guilty of it at some point. You know, you get so wrapped up of what's going on in your immediate community that you don't have either the energy, the time, or you just don't care to see what's happening globally and how what's happening in your neighborhood is happening everywhere around the world. So I think, you know, we all are guilty of that. But that you do make a very good point. I want to open up to, I think we have a student that has a question. Her name is Jadalyn Hernandez. I don't know, is she gonna, do you want me to ask this or does she want to get on and ask? Well, I'll ask. Oh, you're here? Okay, great. Good. Welcome.
Okay.
Tell us where you're from, how old you are, what grade you're in, and your question.
I'm from Philadelphia. I'm 17 years old and I'm in 11th grade. I'm a junior. And my question is for y'all is how has Black Lives Matter movement changed your mindset?
Antonio, do you want to go first?
Could you just repeat the last part? I didn't quite get it. How did Black Lives Matter change what?
I said, how has the Black Lives Matter movement changed your mindset?
Yeah, I think I want to say, I want to start, thanks for your question. How do you pronounce the name again? Jadalyn?
Jadalyn.
Jadalyn, is that correct?
Yes.
So thank you for your question. This is a great question. So very profound too. I don't know if I'm able to answer the how does it change my mind already. But I want to mention something back to what June said about one, reimagining the whole understanding of, right? And the second, she said, elevating that imagination. Am I correct? So then I want to acknowledge someone who has been doing this his whole career and who left us last week, Charles Mills, right? And he's been saying that the whole root, and June was talking about that all the time there when she was saying, what are the roots of all this, of the institutional anti-Blackness racism, is the whole idea of liberalism, right? We live, that the idea of that we live in a liberal society, the understanding of liberalism is actually white, male, right? So what liberalism is part of what whiteness is, and the oppression of non-white people, especially Black people, right? So then back to Jadalyn's question. Jadalyn, I think one of the questions of that, the hugest impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on me, even as a scholar that studies race, racism, anti-racism, and the Black movement in Brazil, is a search for understanding what June was mentioning, the roots, the deepest. Where is the fountain that all these institutions are drinking from and getting their energy, right? What is it, like, just like a tree and its roots, what is bringing life to that tree? The tree of anti-Blackness racism is for me, it's more a search not on individual people or someone is racist or somebody else is to what can we do? It's challenging me to think, what can we do at this elevator, like June said, elevator, reimagine, what can you do at this deeper level? And honestly, it's, I want to study more. It only makes me like that. So we all need to study more this, so we do what Charles Mills has been telling us to do his whole career. And I really invite everybody to there's tons of talks by him on YouTube that people can, from his great books, you know. So that's it. Jadalyn, I hope I answered your question.
And I'll just jump in here and say thanks for shouting out Charles Mills again. Absolutely, yeah, one of the greats with the ideas, etc. What did how did the Black Lives Matter change my mindset? I tell you, it did so much for me, because I am not just, you know, I've been around for such a long time with other movements, meaning when I was a young woman, let me just say this to you, I did not expect racism. I didn't even think it existed anymore. I know that's hard to believe, but as a young woman growing up in post-colonial Jamaica, I thought we had shed the colonizers. Remember, the Black Power movement had happened, right? I
Right.
saw we were like rocking our afros. We changed our names. Bob Marley was singing about emancipate yourself from mental slavery, you know, one love. I mean, we were ready to take on the world, man. We didn't think racism, we didn't think our color would define us. And as I came to grapple with why did I leave Jamaica? I left Jamaica because of neo-colonial forces, including what now was part of the new colonial machinery, the United States of America, and its impact on Latin America and Caribbean. That said, that when Jamaica wanted to befriend Cuba, when we thought it was our right to hold our hands with our Cuban brothers and sisters, 50 miles. Jamaica, you can see Cuba. Half of our families lived in Cuba. Many of us, we had no quarrel with the Cuban people. But the moment we decided to shed mining, to take our own place in the world, the United States was part of what squeezed us into submission. And it meant that many of us ended up in the very place we never expected to be. I left Jamaica and went to Canada. I'm just gonna bring it around to say, so what is the Black Lives Matter meant to me? First of all, I had to acknowledge that for my children, despite all of my life devoted, and so many people devoted to ridding anti-Black racism and racism in general, we were faced and confronted again with the fact that this time had to be different because we cannot afford another generation. For you, Jadalyn, you are 17. When I was 17, I thought the world would not look like this. And I don't want you to say the same thing when you get to my age. So the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, gave me great hope and inspiration. It put juice back in my body. And I decided I'm going to redouble my energies and really work this time at the roots. Just like you said, I'm digging up the roots now. I am not putting up with the peripheral things. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, we'll just chime in. Jadalyn, thank you so much for your question. And I think when I think about what the Black Lives Matter movement has taught me, or has like what I have learned specifically last year, I think it's that I can't stop, and that I just have to like go harder. I think that was one of the things, because I realized like I cannot rely on so-called allies that turn out to be the most performative allies that you can possibly imagine. And I realized like I have to really do more. And that's why I said before, like I want to invest more in our own communities and to educate each other. And like I have to do more in terms of like what is my privilege, what can I do something. Like for me, it being the educational system in Germany, like I want to find ways in which I can have like a bigger impact, or like maybe not a bigger impact, but a different impact as well. Like really see what else can I do. And I also think that specifically last year also has taught me, who am I missing? So when the Black Lives Matter movement was so focused and so many people did demonstrations in the middle of COVID, and I remember like us as a group, Black Lives Matter Berlin, coming together, being like, who are we missing? Thinking about who doesn't have the privilege at those times to go on the streets and demonstrate. And we specifically thought about Black refugees in Germany and how we can support them. So the movement really helped me also to realize, okay, not all of us can do this, and who are the people that can't, and how can we support them as well? Because Black Lives Matter as a leaderful movement has such an intersectional outlook on Blackness, and that is really something that is teaching me something over and over and over again about like all the perspectives that we have to keep in mind when we do certain things. So I think that's what I took away from that the most.
Angelo, you made a really good point, because I know like for me, like in news, we try to make sure that we have diverse voices in our stories. But one of the things that I'm always acutely aware of are the people, like you said, that are doing performative or theatrical. They're just there because it's like, it's in right now, but you know, in the long run, they're not going to be there. And those are definitely the people that I stay away from, not to include in my stories, because it's just going to hijack the movement and the story, et cetera, and it's not authentic. So I definitely get that. We have another question. Let me just look through the chat really quick. Okay, so how would you compare the reactions and the amount of change that stemmed from the death of George Floyd to the amount of change that is expected and needed moving forward? Would anyone like to go first?
Oh, can you maybe read that again? Because
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Of course. Okay, so the question from the student is, how would you compare the reactions and the amount of change so that actually happened compared to what is expected or needed to move forward?
Okay, I can say something that I thought, actually, I was going to ask Jadalyn a question. I always learn a lot from the young minds of my students, right? So I said, how did it change you? How did it impact you, right? Because I think it's the impact that the Black Lives Movement has had on youth can tell us what's going to happen next, right? So I would love if to hear from them, the youth in this space here, this virtual space, how it has, because then we can have really a measure, a gauge, what's going to come next.
But I think the question also was just, so basically from my understanding is, was enough done? So did people react enough to spur any type of change? You know,
Right.
There was enough reaction here in the United States, but
Right.
was that enough to continue change moving forward, or did it fall short? I believe is kind of what this student is asking.
And
So,
I think,
Angelo.
you know, if I were to jump in here, it's a great question. If we think about what happened was the backlash, right? So sometimes a great movement actually creates a great response to hold it back. We saw the rise across the world of the white, you know, the far right. And so I don't think we can be complacent. But there's one big elephant in the room for me, and that is reparations. I think the cost of slavery and the cost, the wealth of most Europe, the wealth of the United States, and much of the countries in Latin America, this wealth was either extracted or used to build societies for other people, but it was on our lands and our backs. It is the wealth that was extracted from countries in Africa and from our own labor. And until we grapple with the fact that the narrative that has been taught is about, you know, the way Europeans built Europe, or about how the white settlers or the Europeans in Latin America built it, until we grapple with the enormous debt that is owed and really start to transfer over some of that wealth to our people, we're still leaving the power. You see, power is important. And I think we need to always look who keeps the power, who makes the decision, who holds on to that power. And I don't think power has shifted, and I don't think resources have shifted. So I think a lot more needs to be done.
Angelo?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think when I think change versus what is actually needed, and I think about the outcomes for me after last year's moment, I don't think I have ever had as many people wanting me to do some diversity, equity, inclusion workshop as after that. But the question is like, for what purpose? Is it, on one hand, it's like, is it just for me to basically make you feel better about yourself? But then also like wondering, who are the people who want me to constantly give talks or give a workshop or give a lecture or anything like that, and who is it accessible to? So I'm like, is it nice to have a change in certain institutions that are putting Black people and Black issues, or generally racism, more on the forefront of topics that are being discussed? Yes, but is it missing the point when it's inaccessible to many people who don't have the educational privilege, or who are actually the people that should listen to that? I do think there is a little bit of a disconnect between like what people think is needed now after this moment and what is actually, and who is actually going to reach. So that is just another dimension to that, in my opinion, because I'm like, when I think of who I have talked to since last year in most of my lectures, most of the people already read something. Most of the people are already having friends that are educating them for free, which they probably shouldn't. Most of the people that I'm talking to are already in courses, have already had a DEI workshop and whatnot. But the people that don't hear anything about this either don't have the access to education or don't want to have the access to education, or they have the privilege of like being in spaces where it just doesn't touch them because they're a community of people that doesn't include anyone who is basically facing these issues. So I feel like that is where change is definitely missing. Yeah.
Do you feel like, because there's some companies that say, we're all about diversity and inclusion, and they have, speakers like you come and do those workshops, but they're not implementing anything in terms of like diversifying their company or making it less homogenous. Do you feel like some of it's just for show? Is that what you've encountered?
For sure. I mean, my job is probably one of the most hated jobs in anti-racist communities, because they're basically like, what are you even doing? You're basically complicit with like companies for them to tell them, oh, you're doing such a great job. You have like 3 more Black employees and now you're good, basically. But I think I personally, first of all, I don't necessarily work with corporates, but I think like my outlook on this is more like I go in there and try to teach people, first of all, we have to understand that the idea of DEI is not for it to stay in business. That's the first thing. And then also you have to understand diversity is a look. It's not an actual action. It's just a look. What comes after is the part that's important. So inclusion, equity, but also I think an element that is missing is social justice, where you have to understand, okay, what are we doing? Are we actually participating in wanting to change something? Are we actually calling out injustices? So usually when I give these workshops, you can pretty early tell like what they want from me. But I never like back down. I'm always like, okay, you cannot stop at diversity, because I will not tell you to employ more Black people if I can't feel secure enough for them to actually enter your company and feel safe there. So that is usually how I start. We talk about safety and we talk about what that means to have specific, like different people with different realities in your job. But definitely a lot of it is performative. I can tell, I can say that, which is why I don't usually work with corporates, but in education.
We just have one more question quickly. I think this is for Antonio. I think this question's for you. When you do, this is for Angelo. When you do DEI consulting, what specific problems do you encounter in organizations, and what solutions do you think are necessary?
I mean, it's kind of what I just touched upon. I think people need to understand that it's not just business. So when we think about DEI and we talk about the profits of DEI, it's often about productivity, profit, finding great talent, opening up a global market. All of these things are things that people want, but actually thinking about human rights and the importance of these things for your personal life and the respect and like desires and needs of other people is the element that is missing. A lot of people don't want that from me because they basically just want to figure out ways in which they can grow their company. The people that I actually do in corporate, but also some people I think do have a part of a revelation there. Revelation, is that the right word? Yes. Where they're basically talking to me and then they realize, oh, maybe this was not, maybe I have to look at it from a different point of view. But it is tough. Like I said, I don't usually work with corporates for that reason, because it can get very frustrating.
Okay, great. Thank you guys. I'm going to turn this all back over to Lauren for closing remarks, but this has been awesome. So thank you for letting me lead this conversation and for all of your insightful input. Lauren?
Great, thank you, Christy, and to our panelists, Angelo, June, and Antonio. As Christy said, thank you for your time and expertise. We could talk about this, and we should talk about this for a long time to come. So one more piece in the conversation we're building around the world about these issues. To our audience, we appreciate you joining our conversation today and submitting your questions, and we encourage you to join us for other upcoming events. On October 12th, we're relaunching the Council Conversation Club, a facilitated small group discussion. Think of it like a mini current events club or book club on foreign policy topics of the day. In November, we're hosting a virtual conversation with UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet. To find out more and register for these and many other upcoming events in person and virtually, please visit our website, wacphila.org, and you can find us all over social media too. Thanks again for being with us and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.